guys hanging in there, staying warm and dry and I guess sane. The worst was driving home last night and then driving back up here today.
It's bad on the road?
It was like I hit a patch where I kind of like did a little. Last night was at work because it was coming down. They hadn't treated them, but the 2-hour delay helped me like wait to come up, and then I hope it doesn't start on the way back because yeah, I'm gonna try to get us through here quickly and get us to completion. I don't think I'll have my 101 class right after this. Are any of you in the 101 class, Intro to Social Work? Okay. So usually, well, last week I said on Thursdays I would do that right after this because that's all online, but some people like it in person better. Are you guys like that? I hate online stuff only because it's just hard to follow. So, I know we're moving quickly on this, but I am getting us to modern day history. I guess we still have a few minutes to let people come in. What questions do you guys have so far, though, to the chapter and how policy is made and how we get the programs to the people that need it, the poor folks and sick folks, and now with the pandemic, every single folk out there, because we might all get another big check. Are you guys all first years, freshmen? So did you get the pandemic relief bill last year for the money they sent through Central State?
Yeah.
Okay, because you were asking about that. My wife got, I think they gave like $1,000 for students, which was nice.
It was something to do like Fifth Thursday. They said it was up to like $700, and you just asked how much you needed.
And is it's a grant, so you don't have to pay it all back. It's like, okay, right. Because you were asking if some of them are loans. Like the one I did through the Small Business Administration, they say I have to pay it back, but I'm applying for forgiveness right now. And that was because our private practice slowed down. Not as many people came in for therapy because of the pandemic. So that's other social policy. The food banks are blowing up. I know that there's a lot more need for food. Housing, mortgage forgiveness is blowing up. So that's another one. And that kind of fits into our definition right there. What is social welfare? And I know we're 2.5 minutes early, but we'll get moving so we can get through it all. So social welfare functions of society that are aimed at alleviating distress and poverty. So right now, because of coronavirus, if you guys remember how many people were laid off, you might know someone who was laid off, you might have family. We even took a pay cut. So teachers took a 5% pay cut on May 1st for this whole calendar year. 35 million people were laid off. So you're just no job. And you could, for like 26 weeks, collect unemployment. So that's why most recently we've had a lot of things aimed at alleviating that stress. And we've got a kind of bad economy. So it's also a nation's system of programs, benefits, and services that help people meet the needs fundamental to the maintenance of society. So starting with the basics, which would be like food, water, shelter, clothing even, but like a lot of big cities. You all heard of the most expensive cities to live in? Like, are you familiar with how much rent is in those expensive cities? I lived in New York City. Yep, they're one. I lived in Orange County, California, and that was stupid expensive. I rented a one little tiny like 10 by 12 bedroom from a dude in a 5-bedroom house, and that was $550 a month, and all I got was that little room. Like New York is like 1,000. To say a 1 bedrooms, that 2 bedrooms like 1,200 to 1,500 even in LA, and then like 1,800 for a 3-bedroom. So, some are having like rent forgiveness and mortgage forgiveness and things of that nature. Now, this is where, oh, of course, it's going to crash out on me before I go there. So, the Federal Reserve, I already went past it. This is where I have a quick 10-minute video that will be not impossible to follow, but like explaining the Federal Reserve System. So, in the United States, we have a banking system called the Federal Reserve. This is how all of our money gets out in America. And this is actually, they were established in 1913. So they're not even 110 years old yet. But they buy and sell treasury bills and bonds. That's where I kind of get lost because I'm like, what the heck is a treasury bill? What the heck is a bond? But it's money. So like, just think of this stuff as money. And like the treasury bills are like interest in our country. China and Saudi Arabia and a few others used to own a lot of U.S. treasuries and even bonds. So they own a piece of our country. They've recently sold them because they've seen we've gone into recession. But the Federal Reserve is like the central bank. And the cartoon I have, it's a quick 10-minute cartoon, but it explains all of this. And it's still hard to follow. So if you don't get it, it's okay. It's just important to know how money, what are your all's majors again? Biology?
Justice.
Okay. So for all of our majors, yours included, IT, do they call it IT or do they call it something else? Information technology? Computer science. So how money gets around, like biology grants to study the wildlife and criminal justice grants. Social work is heavily dependent on it. And we'll dip into the video here. But it influences how much dollars are available. So like last year we printed 1 trillion of them, which is crazy. That's a lot of freaking money. And it influences that by how much it requires banks retain as reserves. And it controls the discount rate. So I'm going to refer to the video because I can't even explain that myself. But this is actually that she used to be the Federal Reserve chairman, but now Biden just put her in as another, maybe it's the central bank person. So Janet Yellen, and actually I only have 8 minutes and 50 seconds for you guys to watch because the beginning was kind of boring.
It's a big deal. It's a big deal because of monetary policy.
Let me, because they have little things in here. Yeah, they have little facts. Like Henry Ford perfected the assembly line and could produce a Model T in an hour and a half. That was that first car 100 years ago. Foxconn uses 10,000 factory robots and plans to have as many as 300,000. So this video is a little old. The concern there is that like we're replacing people with robots, so there's not as many jobs. So anyway.
The Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States, and it's commonly called the Fed. Europe has the European Central Bank, or ECB, and other countries have institutions that play similar roles. Most central banks have 2 important jobs. First, they regulate and oversee the nation's commercial banks by making sure the banks have enough money in their reserve to avoid bank runs. Their second job, and the job we're going to focus on today, is to conduct monetary policy, which is increasing or decreasing the money supply to speed up or slow down the overall economy. Monetary policy is what makes the Fed and the Fed chair so influential.
Let's start with interest rates. An interest rate is the price of borrowing money. When banks lend money, they expect to be repaid the amount they lent, which is called the principal, and a percentage of the principal to cover inflation and to make some profit.
Have you guys ever gotten a loan from anything, for anything, or had to, from your parents even maybe? Like, I'll pay you that $25 back next week, I promise. Sometimes, usually the parents don't charge interest, but if you borrow it from the bank, they're going to charge you 5% interest. You know, like, well, I guess nowadays interest rates are really low. Like I had to borrow, gosh, this was terrible. Our car, I'll do the white Honda car. I plug in an electric car. I had to borrow $17,000 to buy that, and I pay 3% interest. So, and it's a 5-year loan. So basically, what that means is every $10,000, I pay $300 extra on it. So over 5 years, I'll pay like $1,500 in interest extra above that 17,000 I borrowed.
That percentage is called the interest rate. The number of car loans, student loans, home loans, and business loans that get made depends on interest rates. When interest rates are low, borrowers are finding it easier to pay back loans, so they'll borrow more money and spend more. When interest rates are high, borrowers will borrow less and therefore spend less. In the US, the Fed doesn't have the power to tell banks what interest rate to charge customers. So instead, the Fed manipulates interest rates by changing the money supply. If the Fed increases the money supply, there'll be plenty of money for banks to loan out. Borrowers will shop around for the best deal on a loan, and banks will be forced to lower interest rates because they're gonna have to compete, or else no one's gonna borrow from them. A decrease in money supply has the opposite effect. Less money supply means that banks have less money to loan out, so they're gonna try to get the highest interest rate possible. So less money, higher interest rates. If the central bank wants to speed up the economy, they can increase the money supply, which will decrease interest rates and lead to more borrowing and spending. That's called expansionary monetary policy. If the central bank wants to slow down the economy, they decrease the money supply, less money available will increase interest rates and decrease spending. That's called contractionary monetary policy.
So right now, our economy is very slow because of the pandemic. Like they had all those layoffs, tons of people without work. So probably the Fed is going to try to speed it up. And yes, that's why they printed like $1 trillion, and interest rates are like the lowest ever. To buy a house, it's at like 2.5% interest, where 5% was like a 30-year low a few years ago.
Here's some real life examples. After the dot-com bust and then 9/11, the US economy was in a slump or a recessionary gap. Output was low and unemployment was high. To speed up the economy, the Fed boosted the money supply, which lowered interest rates. This made borrowing easier, which increased spending. And as a result, the economy began growing again, albeit slowly. Here's another example. In the late 1970s, prices were rising up to 13% per year. Inflation is usually more like 2 to 4%. The Fed chairman, Paul Volcker, decreased the money supply, causing interest rates to shoot up. People bought fewer homes and cars, and businesses invested less. Contractionary monetary policy drove down inflation, but with the downside of increasing unemployment. There are just no easy answers here. Sorry. During the Great Depression, though, the Fed blew it. 73 years later, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke admitted, "We did it. We're very sorry. We won't do it again." So what did the Fed do wrong? Well, there are two things that keep the banking system healthy: confidence and liquidity. When customers deposit money in a bank, they need to feel confident they're going to get their money back. In the early years of the Great Depression, the Fed allowed several large banks to fail, which caused widespread panic and bank runs in other banks. The result was a third of all banks collapsed. The banks failed because they didn't have liquid assets, which is a fancy pants way of saying the banks had stocks, bonds, mortgages, but not cash money. So when depositors rushed to take money out, the banks couldn't pay. The Fed gets blamed for prolonging the depression because it didn't give banks emergency loans, which would have increased the liquidity in banks and the money supply in general. But how does a central bank change the money supply? In the US, there are three main ways. Let's go to the thought bubble.
When you deposit money in a bank, the bank holds a portion of deposits and loans the rest out. This is called fractional reserve banking. The fraction of deposits the banks are required to hold in reserves is conveniently called the reserve requirement. The first way the Fed can change the money supply is by changing that requirement. Decreasing the reserve requirement will increase money supply, and increasing the reserve requirement decreases money supply. The Fed is the bank.
All right. I know this is a lot of information, so it's okay if it's not going to come fast. But like, do any of you guys have any money in the bank? Like right now, I probably would pull mine up. I think I have $2,000 in the bank. If I put that into my bank, they're allowed to loan out that $2,000 10 more times to other people, which is kind of messed up, actually. It's called fractional reserve, and that's what they're saying. They only have to keep 10% of that money on hand. So they have loans out to other people, cars, houses, at like $20,000 total from my $2,000 I keep in cash. And that's why like they give you more benefits. They're like, you'll get free checking if you do 500 in your bank account. And you get like, I forget what else there is at 2,000. And then if you keep 5,000 in your bank account or have 5,000 directly deposited every month, you get free wires, free, stuff like that. And that's because if they keep that amount in there, they're allowed to lend out 10 times as much, which still is crazy because it's creating money out of nothing essentially. So like if they just have to keep 10% on hand, That's what it is at right now. I know that they showed that go down to 1%, which I think at one point they changed it to. That would mean they would only have to keep my $2,000. They could loan out, I guess, $200,000 to other people. So that's kind of what that looks like.
Anchors banking. So if a commercial bank needs money, they can borrow from the Fed. The second thing the Fed can do to change the money supply is to change the interest rate that it charges banks. That interest rate is called the discount rate. Decreasing the discount rate will make it easier for banks to borrow, and that will increase the money supply. Increasing that rate will decrease the money supply. The third way to change the money.
All right, I meant to stop it on the percentage. So does anybody know what the interest rate is at right now? It's funny that they show these because in just 10 years ago, I know you guys were in grade school, but the interest rate was 5%. So I was mentioning I could put that $2,000 in the bank, or let's just use even number, like 1,000. And if I kept it in there all year long, I would get $50 on my interest. You know what I mean? Like if I kept that cash in there, or even if I kept $100 in, they'd give you $5 of interest. You ever get interest statements on your bank account? It's like a penny nowadays. So right now, the interest rate is 0.25% for banks, but we pay about 2.5%. So that's how the banks make money off of us. And the Fed gives it to them for almost free. They just print the money for them.
Easier for banks to borrow, and that will increase the money supply. Increasing that rate will decrease the money supply. The third way to change the money supply is difficult because it requires Janet Yellen to get approval from the Illuminati, the secret cabal that runs the world. Nah, I'm just kidding. The third method is called open market operations. This is when the Federal Reserve buys or sells short-term government bonds. Now, a government bond, or something called a treasury bill, is an IOU issued by the government that says, I'll pay you back later. Banks hold those bonds because they earn interest and are generally less risky than stocks. If the Fed buys these previously issued government bonds from banks, it increases that bank's liquidity and increases the money supply. If the Fed issues more bonds, the banks will have less liquidity and less money to loan out, and that'll decrease the money supply. And the U.S. deciding how many bonds to buy and sell is done by the Federal Open Market Committee.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. With these options at its disposal, the Fed can increase or decrease the money supply pretty darn quick. The option they use most often is open market operations. During the 2008 financial crisis, when the economy was in severe recession, the Fed went straight to work buying massive amounts of bonds, boosting the money supply and dropping interest rates to practically zero. But it wasn't enough. The economy was still in bad shape, so the Fed did something very uncommon in the history of central banks. It increased its monetary stimulus through something called quantitative easing. We call it QE at work because QE rolls off the tongue more easily than quantitative easing. Plus, who knows how to spell quantitative? Basically, it's when central banks buy up longer term assets from banks. So not only was the Fed buying regular treasury bills, it was also buying things like home loans, aka mortgage-backed securities. They did all this with made-up money. This QE has raised worries about massive inflation. When you add a lot of made-up money to the economy, prices can rise.
So that's the Zimbabwe dollar that they always reference. It also happened in Weimar, Germany in the 1930s when they printed money. So paper money, because it's made out of paper, they can make as much as they want. And the problem being that it makes your money worth less. Like if you had only $1 trillion in the economy, we buy gas and milk and bread for like the same price. But then when you double it to $2 trillion, technically that bread and gas and milk will also double in price. And so they were up to $100 trillion notes. So this is in Zimbabwe, and some of they had to bring like wheelbarrows full of money to buy stuff. It was kind of nuts.
Milton Friedman observed, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So if the Fed has been increasing the money supply steadily since 2008, why has the actual inflation rate stayed so low? Of course, as always, the answer is complicated. Many economists say it's because banks haven't loaned out the money. Remember, banks have to hold about 10% of their deposits in reserve. The other 90% is called excess reserves. Pretty straightforward, which is basically the amount that banks are free to loan out. Under normal conditions, banks would prefer not to hold a lot of excess reserves because holding money doesn't make money. But since 2008, excess reserves skyrocketed. This means that banks held the money and it never really got into the system. Why? Some say it's the stricter lending regulations, but also borrowing a bunch of money for a house seemed a lot scarier. Others suggest that low inflation in the US is the result of uncertainty in Europe, and that's caused foreigners to hold dollars. Some argue that it's because the economy is still sputtering. One thing's for sure, as the economy continues to pick up speed, we'll see the Fed clamping down on the money supply to increase interest rates. After all, it's the Fed's job to take away the punch bowl just as the party's getting started.
So now we've talked about the two main ways economists speed up or slow down the economy. Fiscal policy, which is changing government spending or taxes, and now monetary policy, which is changing the money supply. In an ideal world, the economy would always be perfect and we wouldn't need these tools. But the world isn't perfect, so sometimes intervention is necessary. So which one is better? Well, like any clear, unambiguous question in economics, the answer is it depends. It depends on the severity of the slump. Many economists argue that for your garden variety fluctuations, monetary policy is more effective. It's usually enacted quickly by experts whose only job is to focus on the state of the economy. But in a very severe downturn, fiscal policy might become much more effective. In 2008, the United States did both. It also depends on whether your country's central bank is tangled up in politics. The US and many other developed nations have worked hard to isolate their central banks from politicians who might be short-sighted. The result is that monetary policy generally works and doesn't have a lot of side effects.
So the next time you see Janet Yellen in a magazine listed as one of the most influential people, you can shout, "Hey, I know who that is and I know what she does." The people in your dentist's office might freak out, but maybe not.
Maybe they watch Crash Course Economics.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching Crash Course Economics. It was made with the help of all of these nice people. Now, if you want to support Crash Course's open market operations, head on over to Patreon.
All right, so you were asking if like student loans would be forgiven. I don't know if any of you guys were taking out student loans. My guess is that student loans will not be forgiven, and here's why. If I can find any of you guys borrowing money to go to school. Do they only give you like $5,000 the first year, $7,000 the second year, $8,000 the third year, and like $9,000, and then you get Perkins loan, which is the free $6,000, I think, in undergrad, and then in graduate school they give you like $21,000 a year. Here's why I don't think that they're going to forgive student loan debt. If it wants to open up for me. In graduate school, they give you about $21,000 a year. And you can stay in there up to like 10 years. So that's how much I owe.
You said that's how much you owe?
Yeah. That's why I have a feeling I'm not going to forgive it. You were asking before class started, you're like, you think Biden will forgive the loans? So yeah, for graduate school, I did my master's for a few years and then the doctorate you get 8 years to do your doctorate and they lend you $21,000 a year. And the crazy part to me is the interest, right now they're all in deferment. So we're not paying on them until November, and then they do the income-based payment plan. So I have to pay like $250 a month, but, they do have the public service forgiveness if you teach at a public school or work as a social worker or do a job in the public eye. If you do that for 10 years, they do forgive them. But there's about $1 trillion in student loans. So ultimately, the reason we go over this and why it's in the PowerPoint in the first place, like the Federal Reserve, is because this is what funds our policies. So like that printing of money, that's kind of how they gave out the student loans. Like the student loans, they kind of created out of thin air, like that wasn't money or gold sitting aside somewhere. And they're like, okay, here, we'll take some of this gold and lend it to you. Like they printed that money and gave it to us to go to graduate school or undergrad or whatever. You saw the American debt clock that we had showed the other day. And it's, it's moving fast. Trying to see okay, yeah, that is filming. So a lot of our social welfare depends on how much money they're giving us and how much they lend out and, how they pay, like the student loan program, that's about $1.5 trillion. A lot of the social work jobs, they're funded by grants and loans that you might get on grants.gov. And hopefully it's equally distributed and equitably distributed through social welfare. So social welfare is the occupational welfare benefits received because you are employed and a member of your family is employed. So one example is health insurance. Any of you guys get your health insurance from your mom or your dad still? Because you're supposed to get to you're like 26, right? Is that kind of the new cutoff? So back in the old days, if I wanted to stay on my parents' insurance, I had to be a full-time student. Otherwise, they would not let me stay on their insurance. I think you guys get it no matter what, I'm guessing, because that was like Obamacare and the laws in 2010. And so that's an example of a occupational welfare benefit. So someone in your family has that health insurance, and so you get it, which is kind of cool. There's other ones, so social decision-making process by which a course of action is selected, defined, and promoted. So product or outcome of that process. So the social policy, the things that we're trying to push forward are things that give the benefit to all peoples. In the old day, there are a lot of us that didn't have insurance. Like, I don't know if you guys remember or had family members that didn't have insurance. Like, it was bad in 2010. There's like 100 million uninsured Americans, and you just wouldn't get insurance because it was expensive. So Obamacare did help that. We don't know how much is funded by printing money. It's one of the challenges. Another one here, another example, social services. So the social services are activities conducted by social welfare institutions. A lot of good examples there, like VA. Any of you guys heard of VA before? It's the Veterans Administration. So like if you had a family member fight in the war or join the military, sometimes you don't have to be deployed as long as you're active duty, like you could be called out. We haven't had a new war in 4 years. That's like a new record. In the United States, we usually have a new war with someone in the Middle East, Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan every 2 or 3 years. So new record. We have not had a new war in 4 years, and that's the first longest time since Jimmy Carter, which was almost 50 years ago. So we'll see if that stays, like it's something that, again, VA is an example of a social service that you get if you were a military person. Social Security, some of your parents or grandparents get. When you hit the age of 62, you start collecting that money back that you pay into your paycheck. So you look at your paycheck every time you get it and you're like, oh my gosh, why do they take out that much in taxes again? The idea is in 50 years, you get it all back. When you're either 62, 65 is the average age of retirement. And then if you can wait till 70, they pay you more back, like a late retirement. And that's based off of the average age of a man, which is like 70 something, or the average age of a woman is 80 something. So, the social services are personal services to individuals based on relationships. Institutional services are income programs like housing projects and the like. So like Section 8 housing, some of the food pantries and things of that nature are more institutional services. Personal services are because your mom still works or because your dad still works, you get insurance. Right now, I work and I give insurance to my daughter, my wife, and then I guess in 3 months, my son, because I work. If not, we would go on to the exchange, which I actually see they've opened the Obamacare exchange back up, and you can get insurance. You still have to pay for it, but it's based off of income, like however much you make. So social work, the definition here is a professionalized occupation which operates largely in the delivery of social services and the social welfare institutions. So a lot of social workers are the ones who would deliver and help with the services delivered, with Obamacare, with Section 8 housing, with food pantries, with mental health services is probably the biggest expansion from Obamacare that came. Now we get to go to political definition. Any of you guys heard of liberals before? I love how this book goes through it because they just kind of like put it right out there. So liberals, ideology, social policy, and government intervention Liberals support government intervention in the economy to offset the failures of capitalism and the market economy. So they disfavor legal enforcement of private morality, and they insist on equality of access to access and opportunity. Conservatives, any of you guys ever heard of conservatives before? Usually tend to be Republicans, so they believe in the role of government, should be limited. They place greater emphasis on economic free enterprise and then encourage individual achievement and favor the expansion of the private sector. So some structural functional theory majors assumptions are stability, harmony, and evolution. So essentially they're saying liberals argue government should provide more and give more things out for free. Conservatives argue that the government should be less involved and kind of backed off, and people should earn it, so to speak, like you have to earn your living. So some major assumptions of the conflict theory are competition for like scarce resources. And that comes back to like printing money. Do you think we could print money ad infinitum forever? Like, you know, it's a scare. Like ultimately, what does money do for you? What do you guys do with your money? Right. And what would be the first things that you think that you spend it on? Like, ideally. Food, right? Yeah. So you got it. So like basic needs. So that's something to keep in mind. Like usually money is like a form of energy that we hold for our labor that we gave to our employer, whoever it was. My first job, I got $4.25 an hour to flip some ribs at Burbank's Bar and Grill in Cincinnati. I also did a volunteer job for like $2.50 an hour at a camp. So that hard work comes to money, and you hold it and you buy food, usually first food, water, shelter. So like the basics to be able to keep that warm house and a full belly to work the next day. Sometimes it feels like you make just enough money to make it back and get a warm house and a full belly. And that's kind of the scarce resources. That's kind of what I'm going at. The scarce resources are food, although luckily we have enough in America. Other countries, not so much. During the pandemic, we've gotten less food in America. And then housing, which is kind of a scarce resource. I know that sounds weird, but you know, if they're charging that much for rent in New York and LA and all those places, it's scarce enough that people are like, yeah, I'll give you $1,200 a month to live here. I'd rather go to downtown Xenia, Ohio, where it's like $335 a month to buy an efficiency apartment, or you can buy a house for like $30,000. You know, like it's so another argument is structured inequality. So that means that those who have power and get the rewards strive to maintain them. So people that are in control, I would say the government, for instance, they like to keep it so that they always stay in control also. Now, they do have to give us enough food, shelter, and resources to stay alive and work for them. But that's some of the arguments between, you know, conservatives and liberals. They kind of missed out. Do you guys know the other two major parties that are in like the most elections? Because that's what they skipped. They didn't include the Green Party, which is like a third party on the left side, and they didn't include libertarians, which is a third party on the right side. So some people that are more like centrist will vote either libertarian or Green Party. It's a third party. So economics, which I know that most of us don't want to know too much about, but we want to know enough that, you know, we make good money and treat our family well and can survive and thrive in this economy. So economics is the study of income, production, distribution of goods, and distribution of services. And then the social systems used to allocate scarce resources for different uses. So again, food, like you said, most of our money nowadays goes to food. They say, so there's a percentage of your overall income that should go to food and then housing. And then usually nowadays in America, it's like 30% of your overall income goes to housing and maybe 12 to 20 some percent goes to food. And I feel like that's creeping up to where it's, it's taking a lot of our money to buy food. And that's when you do get actually uprisings within governments, like especially in the Middle East. It was just 10 years ago when the cost of bread got to a certain level, there are people in the streets, you know what I mean? Because like you can't eat for an equitable price, you get pissed off and usually blame the government for it. So that's one thing that comes up from it. Also in the economic sphere, there's two major concerns of policymakers in the economic sphere. One is growth, the total, the increase of total output. So they were mentioning that in the video. The U.S. has supposedly had 2% and 3% growth the past several years. China, for whatever reason, they say it's grown at a rate of like 5, 6, and 7%, which is crazy. But you see it in their population. Anybody know how many people live in China by chance? It's like a fourth of the world population. It's 1,600,000,000, I think. And then India has about 1,500,000,000. Another thing people look at is equality, how that output is divided among the population. So are we getting an equal distribution? And some countries, you see that more dramatic than others. At least here, like when I lived in El Salvador and Nicaragua and had a dirt floor and like chickens in the backyard and whatever, they always are like, so every poor person in America has a flushing toilet? I was like, oh yeah. And they're like, every poor person in America has like a TV? And I'm like, yeah, like just things that we just don't really think of much, you know what I mean? Like we take it for granted. Like we get food and we get affordable subsidized electricity and whatnot, but there, like, as I had to flush the toilet down there with a bucket. So you get like a 5-gallon bucket of water and you dump it in the top, and that's what flushes the toilet. So it's just a different, and then like their major food was beans and rice. That's when I became a vegetarian living down there, because like living in solidarity with them, I just started eating more beans and rice and just simple foods. So equality is something. India is probably twice as bad. I feel like when we went to India with the social work program through Miami University, there are just people all over the streets.
So they didn't have like government assistance?
They have some, but they have like 10 houses and stuff. It was so weird. Like they had houses made out of like, just like pieces of metal. After the hurricane, we were helping them build water filtration systems and latrines and like plastic housing. So they have some guys. It's really hard to explain it, but like the handouts we get here are a lot different than the handouts they get in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and then especially India. So they have some, but they don't have like, I would say probably the military power that the US has, that sometimes gets resources from other countries and cheap fruit and cheap bananas and cheap coffee, even cheap oil to like bring back to the US. In Nicaragua, I just got some pictures from my brother, we're like brothers down there now. And he just got 100 chickens. I actually don't know how he got this, but he was super excited. I took some pictures of him because it was kind of funny. He was, he was watering them because, it's so hot down there right now. It's like 70, 80 degrees. He was like, he's going to try to sell them. He was on, what's that, Facebook, FaceTime or whatever. So he's actually probably my age. I think he's like 41. I'll be 43 this year. And I showed him a picture of my chickens in the snow, and he was cracking up. He's like, what the hell? You got frozen chickens. So different governments have different things. Like our GDP is $17 trillion a year, the gross domestic product. I think the average income in Nicaragua is $450 a year. So they live off of $450 US, which is like about, they say the majority of the world lives off of less than $2 a day, which like blows my mind. So most people in all other countries, now let it be known, food is less expensive over there. And to buy like a Toyota truck in Nicaragua, it's the same price as buying a Toyota truck in America. But to buy beans and rice, it's like 25 cents. Whereas buying beans and rice up here, it would probably be like $3, $4, $5. I don't know. So food is usually something that most people can afford because, like I said, if food gets too expensive, there's an uprising in the streets. And that's why even in America, we have food pantries all over. We have food stamps. We make sure not to have those hunger lines that we had during the Great Depression. So I'm going to kind of cut it here because I want to stop. Well, it's getting back to monetary policy, but I want to get back into that next class because it is hard to understand all of it. They explained this in the video, but we'll get back and do it again because this is how, again, we pass out. So some of the tax, all taxpayers, these are ideas of tax. Actually, so which one do you think you guys would want to pay? A proportional tax, which is all taxpayers pay the same amount, or would you want a progressive tax, which is the more you make, the more you pay, or would you want a regressive tax, which is the less you make, the more you pay? It's kind of a confusing scenario, but
Probably, I don't know. Probably progressive.
the middle one you said, or the right? I feel like that's what we have. Like up to $25,000, we don't really pay taxes much. You pay Social Security income and whatever, but we usually get a refund up till making 25 to 35.
So when you make a lot, you have to, I mean,
So, are you asking about progressive tax?
I don't know, but I was talking to my daddy about it, and he was like, he said something about making too much is I forgot.
You pay a lot more. Like if you make six figures, it might even be $250,000 now. You have to pay almost 50% of your money goes to taxes. Yeah, so if you make six figures, you're going to give 50,000 back to the government with like city government, state government, federal government, local, snow plows, garbage collection, streets, Social Security. But if you only make 25,000 a year, more than likely you'll pay the tax on your paycheck, but you still get like a refund. You know how everybody gets a refund. So is that what he was kind of saying? Maybe like if you make too much, you'll have to pay a ton of it back in taxes.
That makes sense.
You think you should be able to keep it? You're saying?
Yeah, at least majority of it.
I know it's tricky.
Maybe 25%, I guess, but like they act like those people most of those people don't have student loans and stuff.
I don't know. I mean, I would say baby boomers probably don't have student loans. I'm Generation X, is from 1965 until 1980. We have a lot of student loans. Millennials have a ton of student loans. So they're from like 1981 until 2001, I think. So some of you might be millennials, and then I don't know what generation you guys after that are considered. Like, were you all born in like 02 and 03? So yeah, I don't know. And then a weird thing is if I did make six figures, which you don't as a teacher or a social worker, I would probably have you pay 10 to 15% of your income back to your student loan. So right now I only pay like 25% on my student loan, $250 a month on student loans. But if I made six figures, I would probably be paying $1,000 a month on student loans. You know, so it's kind of the same thing, you know, with the progressive, proportional, and regressive tax. So there is no right answer to it. Like, would you guys rather live in a communist country or a socialist country or a capitalist country?
I don't know. I'd rather live in my own island.
Right. I feel like only in capitalism, though, you can make that six figures and keep at least half of it. If you were in communism, the government takes all your money and then divvies out like a house and some food. Cuba, China, and who's the other one? I guess Iran are the last few communist countries left. Socialism, we're kind of on the cusp of because we do take care of our people. We try to at least, you know, like that's the whole point of social policy is to make sure everybody's fed and housed and can have access to education and different work. I still get confused by this. We just watched a video on monetary policy. Did any of it make any sense to some of you guys? Because it is hard to understand. So I will give you that. The weird thing to me is that the bank's only got to keep 10% of your money on reserves. So if we all went back to the bank on the same day, like, dude, I want my money back. They're like, whoa, hold on. 'Cause I don't have that money on hand. You know what I mean? And that's what they call a bank run. That's what happened during the Great Depression, and that collapsed a lot of banks. So it's weird that they're able to just take my $2,000 that I make every month for teaching, and they can lend 20 grand out to everybody else. And we just have a faith in that, you know what I mean? So that's the whole point of money, is that you have faith in the institution to keep on working. So we'll go over this again next class, because this is difficult to understand. But essentially, the rate which the Fed lends money to banks right now, it's like 0.01%. Like, they're giving banks money for free, and the banks will lend us money at like either 3 or 4 or 5% interest. If you have really bad credit, they'll be like, all right, I'll give you $10,000 for that car, but you got to pay 10% interest. So when you're getting loans and you go out and get your jobs to buy stuff, look at your interest rate. Make sure. Right now, it should only be about 5% at the most. But there are some shysters that'll be like, like those payday loan people. They'll charge you like 20% interest in a week. They'll be like, I'll give you $100, but next week you got to give me back 120. So, and as hard as when you're desperate, you're like, well, dude, I need the $100 now. I got to pay rent or I get kicked out. And they're like, all right, here's your 100. And you're like, I'll give you 120 next week, And so that's kind of where it becomes a social justice issue and kind of unconscionable. So like keeping lending at a fair rate. And then this one's even more confusing to me, but this is supposedly what's crashing right now that could potentially crash our economy. So I do want to study up more on this one, that overnight interbank borrowing. They're like lending out $1 billion to each other. So like Fifth Third goes to PNC Bank, like, dude, can I borrow $1 billion? Yeah, sure, here you go, but you got to pay me back $1.2 billion tomorrow. And they're like, all right, here you go. It's just like, it's a crazy system that's hard to understand, but we should become aware of it, because it does kind of affect what we have to pay for food, what we have to pay for our cars, what we have to pay for housing and stuff. They do. I feel like they keep it murky for a reason. So because we don't understand it, we're like, oh, I don't even want to think about it. But the more enlightened I get about money policy, I'm like, holy crap, they're really lending $20,000 out of my $2,000 I just put into there. So they're allowed to lend 10 times the money out to other people, if that makes any sense. And hopefully we'll make it make a bit more sense next class, because there is a video of how money became worthless. That's the discussion. Because as I had mentioned before, $1 was, it was a silver ounce. And then $20 was a gold ounce in 1933. And nowadays, do you know how much it costs to buy that gold ounce? It's actually 1,857. So they say the dollar has decreased by 96% of its value. So like $1 used to be a silver ounce, and $20 used to be a gold ounce. Now it's almost $2,000 to buy a gold ounce, and that puts money depreciated by 99% of its value. So like the US dollar has just crashed in value, and so just to put it into perspective, I'm like, so our dollar 100 years ago is worth, if I just kept, and let it be known, stuff was cheaper, you know what I mean? You got a silver dollar and you could like fill your tank with gas. And today, if you had a silver dollar, you still could fill your tank with gas. Because you know how much that silver dollar costs? I'll make you guys guess before I look it up. Because they sell them on AppMax. So yeah, you still, and that's what holds inflation for people. Oh, those are cheaper ones that they made in the 70s, but this is probably more modern stuff. Oh yeah, shopping. So like yeah, silver dollar will still fill your tank with gas. Any of you guys got big cars with big gas tanks? How much does it cost to fill up your tank? 20? So that would fill your tank. There's this, yeah, that's a silver. So that's two of them. That would be a silver $1. That's probably the appropriate price. So if you held your money from 1960, just like stored away that silver that was $1 back then, is now worth $29.95.
So
Which
they
is,
would automatically fill out, like, so if you had it and you spent it, it would, so it's not really at all.
you're saying if you had this?
Yeah.
Well, some like old grandmas and grandpas kept all of these like in their piggy banks because it was silver. And they knew, like ask your grandma or ask your mom or ask your dad or whoever you're able to talk to if they've ever seen some of these. You still can find these. I used to go to the bank and I would get a box out. It was $500. You get a box and you go through all the coins. And any of these dated in the 1960s had silver in them. And in 2011, I used to find 2 or 3 per box. So I would just like sort through it and then I'd redeposit it back in the bank. And then I'd take it out again, sort through it, redeposit it back. So at one point I found a whole roll of them. So yeah, that's kind of so again, the concept to wrap our brain around, they changed this strangely for the good because they wanted to fund programs to like feed people, to be able to subsidize housing, to give out student loans. But in the process, they did create some inflation with it. And what inflation does is make gas costs more, make food costs more, so there's a balancing act. They have to make the inflation not go up more than 2% a year is what they go for. But even at 2% a year, how long does that take for food prices to double? Wouldn't that be like 50 years? But if you do compounding interest, it's different. It might even be like 30 or 40 years and food prices have doubled for sure. So yeah, ask your parents if they have any of these. Those things are worth silver ones though. They still make these coins. You still can find these coins, but they have to be dated 1960s or earlier. And that's when they're actual silver. So like that says 1964, those are all 90% silver, but then from 65 to 69, they were 40% silver. So the monetary policy, it still blows my mind. Like the more that I look into it and we study it and why they did what they did, it was for good intentions, but it did cause problems ultimately. And this, like I said, about 1.5 years ago, something went on here that the Federal Reserve took that over, the overnight lending. And about 1.5 months after that, the coronavirus took over the whole economy and the whole world. So some people are connecting the two, the COVID and the monetary policy. I'm like, wait, what? That sounds conspiratorial to me. But they're like, well, yeah, because the overnight lending was crashing. And so we'll see how, every year they're wondering if they'll crash the system or not. Somehow. Well, and so finishing up, like I said, we'll do this next class, but money should be a store of value. Like if I have that silver dollar from 1964, like my dad graduated from high school that year and he kept some of them, it should store value, like it should be worth the same 20 years later or 10 years later. And the reason they use gold and silver even in the Bible is because it doesn't rust. It doesn't like corrode. It is divisible equally. So like you cut it in half and it's worth half as much. You can melt it down and make a big, like people have gold and silver jewelry and all this stuff. And it's, it's a facilitator of transactions and a unit of account. So it's probably the only money they accept all over the world. In China, you can give them gold. In Russia, you can give them gold and silver. So, but most people quit making their money out of it in the 60s and the 70s, like Canada too. So we'll go over that monetary policy a little bit more as it is super, super confusing. We also had a lot of wars, like the Vietnam War kind of took off after they stopped with those silver dollars. But it funded lots of the welfare policy programs, so like our federal welfare policies. Any questions? Are you guys thoroughly confused at this point, or is it making a little bit of sense, hopefully? The idea is to kind of like open up our mind, like, how did that actually work? And why did that go down? Why did we start printing a bunch of money and